One of the tasks that I enjoyed being involved with was the translation of the New Living Translation. And what they did is they had 3 or 4 scholars working on each particular book, and then there would be editorial decisions that were made and amalgamation of some of the translations. And they asked me if I'd be involved in Leviticus. And I said, well, that's not my first choice, but I'd be glad to help in that. And so we were doing that over the course of several years. And then they decided they wanted a commentary series based on the New Living Translation, which was called the Cornerstone Commentary Series. And I thought it was quite important because New Living Translation is one of the most widely used around the world. And to have a commentary based on it, your audience is quite large. And it's also directed, the New Living Translation methodology, if you like, is sense for sense, and it's easier than some of the more literal translations. That is, it's more idiomatic, and it's easier to read, for example, for those from third world areas. So it's not just used among native English audiences. And so the commentary is kind of reflecting in some ways what the approach of the translation is. It's not a high-level academic commentary. It's sound exegesis and theology, but it's directed, if you like, at a lower level than dealing with the actual Hebrew or Greek within the commentary itself. And Leviticus was a challenge because realizing it's foreign from a lot of our contexts. I mean, most of us don't do much with animal sacrifices. So how do we make it real? One of the things that struck me in reading it, really what it is, it's a manual on worship. We still worship. We do things differently. In fact, usually in North America, well, we know a little bit more about some of our brothers and sisters, but we have some churches that worship with their hands raised as every aspect of their worship, or every worship day, they have hands raised. Then you have some contexts in the next church where they might not even know they have hands. We worship in different ways. Some are highly liturgical. We have a spelled out formal worship practice, and in others there's nothing printed anywhere. Everything's free-flowing. And so all of those are different ways of worship. And another way of worship is what we have in the Old Testament. The goal of worship, praising God, offering oneself and one's gifts to God, are the same in each, but it's just the different means by which one does it. So commenting on that, a book like Leviticus, you have to understand what was going on in the ancient Near Eastern background, how they were seeing what they were doing, what it meant, and then also how do we translate that up to now? Because we're not calling for people to go back and do the actual forms, but the functions are still there. So that helped bridge the gap for me. I'm interested in the ancient history and the ancient religion part, but there is still some material that can be preached. And part of that, one of the areas of distinction that is interesting to think about is the area of clean and unclean, because in our particular understanding, we tie that with sin. If you're unclean, you're sinful. Is being unclean the same as being unholy? Being clean, being holy. Those are different kinds of concepts, because clean and unclean is really talking about ritual access to God. It's able to come into his presence, because God, well, talking on the holy terms, God says, I cannot have contact with that which is unholy, and so trying to find ways through rituals to make oneself able to come into the presence of God. But unclean is kind of a different category. For example, several of the bodily functions make you unclean. You can't have contact with the temple, the tabernacle, at certain times of the month for women. If certain things happen in our lives, touching a corpse, for example, it makes you unclean. There's nothing to do with sin there. These are natural bodily functions. But for example, the contact with blood. Blood is a positive thing if it's in its natural state, flowing through the body, keeping one alive. But if blood is shed for different reasons, it's not any more life-giving. In fact, it's emblematic of death. And so contact with it is not sinful, but it's, if you like, moving one towards death rather than one toward life. And so Gordon Wenham, for example, in his commentary on Leviticus, discusses these things very usefully, I found. And so I recommend him. I'm sure he's on the Logos platform. But it's those kind of things to bring across to people, because there's such a barrier between us and them. When you're using a Through the Bible in a Year plan, for example, most readers come to a screeching halt when they get to Leviticus. But I was trying to say, how can I show there is something there to actually read and benefit from?